Does psychiatric hospitalization cause harm? Question mark. Hi there, I'm Dr. Owen Scott Muir, and we've got a new paper. I know, science, right? Emmanuel et al. In a journal that I didn't know existed, which is the Journal of the New York Fed, did a paper where they evaluated the risk of harm subsequent to psychiatric hospitalization involuntarily using a really novel model. The authors looked at edge cases, people who one doctor could choose to admit or another doctor might not. This was data from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and they had about 1 million people in the sample. And what they found was that the variability or propensity to admit someone to the hospital between doctors is pretty stable. So one doctor is more likely to admit you and the other doctor may be less likely. And they used that variation in who happens to be working with some baseline propensity to evaluate the causal effects of psychiatric hospitalization on an involuntary basis on the portion of the sample who could go either way. And what they found was fascinating. The risk of suicide increased by about 1% causally. That's when you take the increased risk and you subtract the baseline risk. And the risk of subsequent violence, that is being charged with a violent crime committed by the person who was involuntarily admitted, goes up by about 2.6% per 10% increase in propensity of the doctor. So the more likely they are to throw you in an involuntary hospitalization when it was a call that could go either way, the more likely you are to commit a violent crime and be charged with it later. And this is looking at a 3-month period after psychiatric hospitalization, so only the most kind of near-term effects. This is a quasi-experimental design, so there's an element of randomization which allows us to determine causality, and it's the first study that I've seen that, at least to me, conclusively demonstrates there is a causal relationship between involuntary psychiatric hospitalization and increased risk of death, and that's from suicide or overdose, and also, surprising to me, increased risk of harm to others, and that's from violence subsequently that leads to criminal charges. This is sobering, and I hope it leads to more thoughtful use of involuntary hospitalization going forward, because it's risky, not just to the patient, but to the rest of us. When in doubt, discharge.